constant state of fear and misery.
All right, what's up, punks? This is a special edition of Block Digest coming to you on Friday, May 29th. And we have a special guest, Mr. Daniel from Microsoft, who's working on their decentralized identifiers program. So, what's going on?
Nothing much, man. Doing good, doing good. Just getting ready to do a release here soon for the work we've been doing for a while around decentralized identifiers and identities, like we talked about.
And Janine, how are you doing today?
Hello, hello.
So yeah, we've been kind of following that whole program over there for at least I think the last 2 years, maybe three at this point. And yeah, I do have to say, Daniel, I have been a rabid hater of Microsoft for a long time now, and I'm actually really excited by this program. I never thought I would say that Microsoft is building something that I am excited about, but you guys are.
Yeah, no, it's it's different. I mean, it's funny when people hear about this effort that we've had underway for a while. They generally will think like, well, why would Microsoft be doing something like this? And it actually makes more sense, when you talk through it. So, decentralized identity, Microsoft used to be the sort of pillar of centralization. I don't actually think that's altogether true anymore. We do a lot of open source stuff. We're, one of the top open source contributors in the world. But, I don't really personally, Microsoft is a company, I think they're a good company in a lot of ways, but, I'm there for the work. How it all kind of started was many years ago at Mozilla, right around 2011, 2012. We started working on something called Firefox Handshake. It was this little project internally to see about, using these new systems for decentralized identifiers. And, we played around with colored coins and, all the really, really basic things you could do if you wanted to like have an address express something, a transaction in Bitcoin that you have control over via your address express something. And I just, it kind of took a hold where I thought that was going to be the thing that I wanted to do. And so I did that for a couple of years, as a side project, mostly at Mozilla. And then it kind of got more real. Got approached for an opportunity for someone at Microsoft to go work on, Edge at first, in the dev ecosystem. And my mind the whole time, it was like, well, really, I'm just trying to angle to get this stuff going. And my whole goal was I'll give it like maybe 2 years to go to Microsoft, see if I can basically sell it through, because they didn't have this program. This didn't exist, right? It just didn't exist. And I saw it as a really big opportunity because if we're talking about freedom and all these other things like decentralized ID and decentralized money, really that's the two things you got to nail. So I went there with an open mind, thinking I work on browsers, so I can do this. I really want to pursue this other thing. About a year into it, had the opportunity to sell it to basically the VP that kind of ran all the identity services at Microsoft, and this includes like all the existing services like Azure Active Directory, which is sort of a centralized identity system that companies use, and it really actually accounts for about 95% market share in the industry, right, in the enterprise backend identity system. And so so it was actually a really well placed company if you really want to go do some serious identity stuff. So they liked it. They thought it was a good idea. It actually made a lot of things possible that weren't business wise. If you really think about what decentralized identity means, it means that you as an individual own your identity, and your identity is composed of a few things. It's composed of your identifiers, which today in what people use today anyway are email addresses, usernames, things like that. They're all leased to you. They're all things that you get from other organizations, and they can all be taken from you, either on purpose or just business went that way. So, for example, like the government could shut down your website right through ICANN. Your email address, the provider, could just go away. Right? They could just stop services, and now that email and anything tied to it is gone. So we wanted something with decentralized identity that would give you your own identifiers where no one could take it from you, much like Bitcoin, much like you own your Bitcoin. So the system actually does unlock quite a few business opportunities. and just to kind of understand why Microsoft would do this. Having your own ID, the grounding of it, like private keys backing an identifier you own that can't be taken from you, is actually an enabling thing in the business world, in areas like education and other places where there's laws that say, well, you can't just have everything tied to these centralized identifiers. There are certain bylaws for public institutions that kind of mandate this. So we've never had the ability to transition from a paper world, kind of like we did from writing letters to email, in any other facet of our lives, and at scale in a way that had standards behind everything like that. And that's why you still have to do all these annoying things like file all this crap, all over the places, because there is no ID that someone can say, well, Dan at Gmail, like I'm gonna tie your life to Dan at Gmail, right? You can't in some legal senses, and nor should you, really as a person. That should scare the shit out of you, right? Like the idea that somehow I'm going to start tying critical identity proofs and data and app data to something that could be snapped out of existence with a stroke of a pen or press of a key is frightening to me, just absolutely frightening. So that's what the central ID gives you, and it gives you the ability to have control, real control. So Microsoft's interested in it and I'll give you a couple of use case examples. Think about all the stuff that's on LinkedIn right now, right? People can go on LinkedIn, they can make up whatever they want. I mean, there's been some classic examples where people have made up profiles that look exactly like Bill Gates or, any number of like figures that are well known. And you can assert whatever you want, right? You can make it look very convincing. What happens if, we have a system whereby you can, upload your diploma, it can be known that you actually did go to school somewhere, you did get some skill accreditation or whatever it may be, and you wanted to show them your resume and it was verifiable. Well, now all those fakes, all that stuff you see bots on Twitter, that all just goes away, just melts, because they might be able to give something today the appearance of validity, but they can't sign with keys. And if we back IDs of corporations and people and all these other things with keys that they own and IDs that they own, you have to go beat them with a wrench to take those keys. So when Harvard signs it with their DID, you have a pretty good ID it's real. And that's one way, right? That would obviously be in Microsoft's wheelhouse, where we would want LinkedIn to be filled with more attestable, validated information that wasn't just a bunch of BS. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think you kind of hit like the two main things that this can potentially deal with, in terms of ID online, like perfectly. It's that power, and I don't think we really need to give examples here on how that's being widely abused by a lot of namespace operators on the internet today, and then also just this issue of like fraud. Like we are moving very quickly into a world where you can't really discern the truth of anything you see online. Like it is just getting so easy to fake all kinds of things. Like it's not just a fake picture and a fake name now. Like I could make a video if I want to put the computing resources in it that Donald Trump is saying he's going to nuke China, and how many people are going to believe that?
Yeah, what we've really done, it's a strange asymmetry. What we've really done is we have created the digital means to tell a multitude of digital lies, but never given people the tools to tell the digital truth. And that's the biggest thing of all this. Like you said, you can make up whatever you want. You can be incredibly convincing. We can send each other all the content that we want. We have no way to know if it's really from a person who says it is. And that's crazy, right? It's kind of like we did half the equation. And I think that's what DIDs are going to do, is bring the other half of that equation so that we can actually start telling the truth.
Mm-hmm. And real quick, I kind of want to like concentrate for a minute on like the power of the control over the namespace, rather than kind of the verification of the source of something, because it's like that is just such a massive problem in the world today, where everything is digitizing, and it's like the concept of a namespace, like you need uniqueness there. Like even people in the real world with the same names, like their actual state ID will still have a unique number, some differentiating distinguished thing. And it seems to me like everywhere I look on the internet, the people who operate these namespaces are just policing them, not in the not trying to achieve some kind of civility or neutrality, but just to selectively control what narrative can be propagated in that namespace.
Absolutely, and I can highlight how I think this technology might help that. And an easy example is all the social media stuff going on. It doesn't matter where you fall. I mean, I am, just to put it out there. I'm a libertarian voluntarist, an ANCAP, and I do believe that people should be able to say whatever they want. I think that open discourse is better, right, than boxing people out. Even the worst speech, like I'd rather just you can mute them if you want to as an individual. I don't think that we have to do that. I'd rather try to convince them that there's better ideas. But you see this all over the place where we're starting to create these silos that are kind of, they want to be in control of discourse. And I'd rather empower people. So one way we can do that is DIDs, and I'll just kind of talk a little bit about the structure of a DID. Decentralized identifiers is a W3C standard spec that is on the standards track right now. It'll be an international standard. Microsoft, other companies, tons of organizations are working on this standard. It's not just Microsoft. And we've built one implementation of that. Now, what a DID is generally a big, long, like you said, unique string, and it's resolvable. And what it resolves to, and I'll give an analogy, it's much like DNS itself. Like you look up a domain name, you get a DNS zone file, which contains some name servers, that do routing, and you have a certificate system that backs the security of it. With DIDs, your DIDs are entered in decentralized systems, and what you resolve is this thing called a DID document. And that DID document is a piece of metadata. It's non-identifying metadata. It's not like your actual identity data. It's the keys that map to an ID and the routing endpoints for where you would go to find information that ID might want to offer, right? They could keep as much private as they want, but they might want to offer some public stuff, right? They might want to offer like their nickname or something out there. So what we think of, what we think could be the future in terms of like social media, that sort of thing, is that you would have something called a personal data store. So we call these things like identity hubs, encrypted data vaults. There's a few different things that are going on in the ecosystem right now that we're trying to coalesce. But essentially what it would look like is you get a DID inside this metadata document that's published against the DID in this decentralized system. You'd put your routing endpoints to your personal data stores. And instead of going and publishing tweets into a silo, into someone else's centralized server, you publish tweets in your own data store instances. And when people follow you, they follow your ID, and they're essentially pulling from your actual data store, whatever tweets, whatever posts of things you want to make public. So in that way, you might have an app that looks a lot like Twitter, but it's actually a composition of streams that you're pulling from people that you want to hear from. Very similar UI. You wouldn't have to change a whole lot. Just how the structure is and who's in control. There is no one in control in terms of like the siloed part. Just changes that paradigm.
Yeah, so let me try to kind of normie break that down. So it's pretty much you would have like, let's use Bitcoin as the example. That's your high level DID zone and what's being committed to. You would have this pretty much data structure with your public key, any ID, metadata you want to or associate with that, like a server address or something, say, where you could go interact with me, and then the proof that was committed to in the Bitcoin blockchain. And then that could literally be indexed or stored or found anywhere and proven, and then you know where to come find me, or something that I left for you on some server somewhere.
Yeah, that's the gist of it. Now, what this kind of dovetails into what we're putting out there, which is this ION thing. I don't know if anyone in the audience hasn't heard of ION before. ION is a layer 2 protocol. Spiritually, like Lightning, I don't think that it is like technically the same. It's a very different protocol, but spiritually, it is a layer 2 piece of software that anyone can run, and it runs atop Bitcoin, and it essentially uses Bitcoin to anchor these payloads of DID operation data. So the operations, when I talk about operations, what it means is changes to that DID document I mentioned. Like maybe I'm Alice, so I created a DID, so I have this create operation. And at the time, I had my key to my laptop, a key that was on my laptop and a key on my phone because I want to associate those devices to my ID. So I put the public keys in the operation. I say these are the first two public keys. Later on, down the road, I might get a new phone, so I need to swap out the key from my old phone for the new phone because I don't want to associate it with my ID anymore because it has power, right? You can sign on my behalf at that point. So I would do an update operation, and essentially what ION is a system where those operations are aggregated. They can be aggregated in batches of up to 1,000, and then they're anchored in the chain via an IPFS hash. So essentially, the nodes in ION, what is inside them is a Bitcoin node, full node, an IPFS node, and IPFS is how they communicate with each other, and then a processing kind of logic module. And there is there's no consensus. It's not a blockchain. They don't actually have to come to agreement because the only agreement the system needs is Bitcoin. And the only part about Bitcoin that we use, unlike something like timestamping, which tons of companies do, right? They'll timestamp like this data existed at this point. We're actually concerned with something a little more complex, which is where in a sequence of events did the data fall? That's what PKI is principally concerned with public key infrastructure. Is I was Alice and I created my ID at time 0, and then I made an update at time 1, right? And then another at time 2. I need to know that those things happen in a sequence for security purposes. So Bitcoin kind of acts as a big clock, like Satoshi first actually envisioned it as time chain. We're concerned with where you fell in a deterministic lineage. And so ION, when you start up an ION node, it reads Bitcoin and finds all these transactions with these IPFS IDs in them, and it pulls the data. It basically starts replicating all the other nodes that are holding the data. It starts pulling it in, and it crunches using a deterministic set of functions and derives the state of all IDs on the network. So you can give it an ID, and it'll say, yeah, I've heard of that. I'll look that up, and I'll give you back the keys and where to find people. So ION is this protocol. It's launching into beta on Bitcoin mainnet as of June 2nd. We really, really encourage people to kick tires on it. It's highly scalable. There's been a lot of attempts in the space. I think this one is a contender. And it will give you IDs that you truly own that are as hard to take away from you as Bitcoin itself.
Mm-hmm. So kind of just like an aggregation layer. How do I put this? So pretty much like a PGP server or a network of those, except the actual coordination of things is actually cryptographically timestamped and verifiable. So you don't just have to kind of sample the nodes and then hope something isn't being revealed to you.
Exactly. So it's basically what Bitcoin solves is a 30-year problem in digital identity systems. I like to, there is not a formal name for it, but it's sort of the holy grail. It's a linear sequencing oracle problem. So it's a type of oracle problem, but the problem in PKI systems, the reason why we have like CAs today, is because there's no one source to say what was the event stream, like what happened when, right, in a linear term, right? And so that's why CAs came to be, is because like they said, fuck it, we'll just throw it out the door. We'll just say what is today, right now, right? Like Google.com is this server because we said it is, because they couldn't figure out how to do this, right? So what Bitcoin actually gives you is an oracle. You can look to it and say, these transactions happened in this exact order, and I can proceed from block zero, all the way to tip, and I can replay history, right? And that's really that's a huge thing for digital identity systems, and I don't even think a lot of people in the traditional digital identity community that's really clicked for them yet.
Yeah, and because it's like the one, and this is like another aspect that's kind of a tricky thing when you start trying to have people use a cryptographic key for something. What happens if you lose it? Or what happens if it's compromised? Because with a PGP server, you just have to trust that all the ones that you're looking at are a representative view, that something isn't being withheld from you, like a key revocation or something like that. And you need that objective indexing before you can even try to have a real secure way to revoke a key or recover a key or have those types of operations that normal people absolutely need to be able to do this safely.
Yeah, and it's funny, when we started this work, the really formal part of the work started at this group called RWAT, Rebooting Web of Trust. Chris Allen, formerly of Blockstream, he's actually been big in the identity community. He worked on TLS, the Internet Security Protocol, and he started a lot of this thinking, kind of reinvigorated a lot of this thinking in the mid-teens. And it's funny, with the first paper that was written about DIDs, a few of the main founding contributors for PGP actually guest posted inside the technical white paper saying, yeah, I mean, we just couldn't do these things before. That's why PGP has these problems, because we didn't have a system like this. And so it's funny hearing from these past attempts, because this isn't all new. We're not creating the world again. They were just missing such a fundamental, strange piece of like counting forward in time with a system you could replay. That was like kind of the crux of everything.
Mm-hmm. Personally, like I get just as excited about the non-financial, potential uses you could put something to Bitcoin to if you just interact with it in an intelligent, scalable way. And I feel like the majority of this space just completely dismisses that utility because of all the shitcoin scams in this space that go, we're going to do it with a new blockchain. And like there is actual massive utility besides just money we can get out of Bitcoin to improve the digital world.
I totally agree, and I would go so far as to say, identity in my perspective, there's many different views and frameworks about how people look at identity. I look at it in a pretty all-encompassing sort of universe view, which is basically everything is identity. Every transaction or transmission, however it is encoded, whether it is my speech that I've vocalized to someone, or it's a digital transmission I send to someone, that is a part of my identity. I'm expressing myself somehow, right? And if that's your definition of identity, what people know and hear and learn about you and things you said and your activities over your life, that's pretty big. Now, money is actually not very big, like compared to that, right? I'm on my phone sending tweets or working and using Slack messages and doing all these identity transmissions, probably 1,000x more than I'm going and buying something, right? Not to dismiss the importance of Bitcoin. I believe in Bitcoin. It's just that the vast majority of your day is spent encoding identity transactions that you would hope probably many stay private to people. So I would go so far as to say DIDs might be even more powerful than the base currency itself. Because, do you want a future where your apps are snooped on by a bunch of centralized companies? Or do you want ones where they're private, more private relationships, encrypted data that companies can't snoop on? And I'm just as concerned about that as I am about money being owned by central authorities.
Mm-hmm. A lot of people look at like the real world type of applications, or like how you could like redo your diploma from college and stuff like this. I think that really those are irrelevant in the grand scheme of things in terms of applications for things like this. It's the digital ones. Like the first thing that clicked in my head when I read through the draft of the spec, or like the state it was in 2 years ago or so, was you just fixed the cloud. Like this type of namespace that is not under somebody's control, that allows you to have an identity coordination point and something to encrypt your data to. Like you just fixed the cloud. The cloud is no longer the name that can be revoked from you. The cloud is no longer the thing where by default, all of your information is just out in the open for that cloud provider to see. Like this piece literally fixes the cloud, which is the direction we're going in terms of the internet that just isn't going to get wound back. And before I saw the types of potential structures like this, like that was a terrifying thing to me. But I genuinely think that in the long run, this project will fix the cloud.
Yeah, I mean, I would never, I try to be, I want to be a little bit reserved and say, there's no guarantees, and actually, Ion's so strange, man. It's we sit in with companies and we talk about Ion, because we're like by far the lead contributor to Ion, and there are some great contributors, and I do want to be controversial here. Some of our greatest contributors right now have been from the Ethereum community. They're people who contribute to the underlying Sidetree protocol, which is a blockchain agnostic protocol. And they are running a version of what basically Ion is, because it's 90% the same code, on Ethereum called Element. And they're actually really great devs, and they've been awesome and contributed a ton. So I want to do a shout out to them, because open source is open source, and I will rep people's good contributions no matter what, right? We chose Bitcoin for certain reasons, but I do want to be a little bit reserved here and say that it won't succeed without the community. Because I've sat in front of business people and they say, well, why should we run an Ion node? Or why should we participate? What's in it for us? And I say, man, you know what? This is pretty decentralized. Like, you don't even have to ask Microsoft's permission. Like, there's no authorities in the system. And I also can't give you things. I can't give you, like Libra, I can't give you some money deal to see secret information about people sending, currency between people. You're not going to have those sort of weird man in the middle things. I can't enrich you in that way. And they kind of look at me like they like it and they don't, right? They're kind of like, oh, it's a public utility. I guess, you know what I mean? I'm actually running it for just the reason that I want this thing, which is kind of wild in the sense that we don't have all those tools, which I guess do lead to bad things to get people, because it is actually decentralized. But it will only succeed if people run the nodes, if people get involved, because it really does. It lives and dies basically on how many people are in the network and maintaining it.
Mm-hmm. And real quick before we can get into like the commitment, agnosticism, I do want to say, like, I don't care that this was built with Ethereum developers, or that it's agnostic like that. Yeah, I actually had a conversation. I think it was 2 years ago at this point, like 2018 at the Lightning Hackathon in Berlin, with a Ethereum developer who came there just to see what the Bitcoin crowd is like. I had a long conversation with him about like all the Web 3.0 stuff they're building over there, and how that's going to be done much more intelligently on Bitcoin. And his response was, yeah, you're probably right. So if they go build crazy stuff over there that gets ported more intelligently over to Bitcoin in the long run, okay, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of like, I was in the open source community for a long time with Mozilla. We accepted everyone. Like, if they were making good code contributions and their ideas were good and they won on their merit, I mean, that's kind of how I was raised up in the open source movement as a self-taught developer. Was I never looked to people's tribes or really anything. I always kind of just looked to like how good are the bits. That's all I've ever really been concerned about in my career. So yeah, just half tip to people who contribute. That we wouldn't be here without. I mean, we created a lot of protocol, but we wouldn't be here without great contributions from a whole wide range of folks. And I'm excited to do this as a community, and really rally the Bitcoin community around this, because, like you said, I don't think it's on many people's radar, the ID portion, and it really should be, because government doesn't need to take your decentralized money to control you. They can just as well do it with identity, right? If we don't decentralize these systems, they might say, hey, it's all well and good. You got that decentralized currency going, man. You really succeeded there, but until we really collapse, like, we can do some pretty draconian stuff if we have a centralized ID system. So I just hope people are not. That seems like a big blind spot in terms of like what the control bottlenecks are. That it's not just money.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's kind of, whatever ID system we build, that's kind of going to be the underlying systemic failure point, that, we're trying to build ID systems that are, I mean, somewhat ID systems, but also more like reputation systems, where it's about what people know or think about you, or what you've done, what you're known for. And we're trying, like, as Nick Szabo says, identity and reputation don't scale very well, because in the past, your identity, a lot of your identity, that's mostly known by you. Some parts of your identity you don't even consciously acknowledge. And then your reputation was about what people around you had seen you do and knew about you in your local environment. So I would say that the risk that a government could come around and just say, well, because you mentioned in one of your blog posts that, the technology space has a different view of what they consider to be identity services versus how people think of the term identity when they're talking about it, which is one about like access, credentials, and authentication, whereas the other one is about like who you are as a person, what you like, what associations you have, and things like that. And like the access credential part, the authentication part, that's something that I mean, in theory, they could. There's always going to be a risk that someone is going to try and take that away from you. But if you're a person who does have that connection with a local community and people do know you, and have interacted with you in person, it's a lot harder for any kind of centralized entity like a government or a corporation to come in and try to like steal your identity. I mean, they can't effectively steal that kind of identity from you because, I mean, obviously it's you knowing yourself and the local people around you knowing you. They'd have to coerce a lot more people in order to take that from you.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. We are, and I'm not speaking on Microsoft's behalf at this point, and several points obviously throughout the conversation. These are all my personal thoughts in many ways. But we are, as a digital identity and decentralization community, we're in a race. I 100% guarantee you that governments will move identity to some form of digital stuff. I mean, unless you're a person who believes like email was the only thing being digitized, like no, we're going to be using paper in the year 3000 or something. I would assert that that's just a clownish idea. So everything is going to move to digital because it makes sense for a zillion reasons, obviously. It's a question of, do we want it to move to digital into a centralized identity or a decentralized one, like you said? And then we work really, really hard to uncork a lot of the authority that identity has stored into these centralized silos. And what I mean is, like, right now, because we didn't have good means of doing what you said, which was forming a community identity of, hey, I'm trusted because I bought 10 apples from you for a year and I always paid on time. Right? That's a form of identity. Like I'm starting to be like, I can form that identity with just another person, right? And right now we have no means of recording it, no means of exchanging it just between peers. So what we've essentially done is we've pushed all proof and all rigor and decision making to be contingent on a very small subset of identity that is lorded over by sort of centralized entities. And that's where the power's been locked. So what decentralized identity gives you the ability to do is to decentralize that, is to say, well, I'm giving you the fundamental basis for creating your own relationships like that, and then you can analyze them and have your own trust scoring on them as a person. But we're in a race to see if we can stand that system up to supplant something that kind of calcifies the old system. And that's kind of, I think, the point we're at right now. And if we don't act quickly, we could be in peril. And I think we have to do that. And we have to get to the point that you talked about, which was a lot of the things that we vest in authorities, we can now form through local views of reputation.
Mm-hmm. You make your identity actually portable in a way where it never was before. Like you can't just pick up with all your stuff and leave the community you've developed deep relationships with for 10 years and just have that reputation move with you. But now the door is potentially open to do exactly that.
Yeah, and it's hugely empowering. I mean, like, so my pinned tweet is like a bunch of things I'd like to see happen, right? Some of those are like gig economy stuff and encrypted communications and all that stuff. DIDs play a huge role in many of those things listed there. One, a couple big ones, obviously comms, right? We all want to use like Telegram or Signal or these, seemingly privacy preserving applications for communication. What DIDs give you is the ability to look up any ID in the world, like anyone that you know of and find, and you can say, you know what, if there's a personal data store connected to the ID and they have like an open port, an open ability to address it, I can encrypt a message to those keys and I can send it to them. So it's essentially a universal form of these encrypted messaging apps, right? From the jump, like everyone essentially gets a universal standard for being able to send encrypted messages and data and everything like that. And that alone, even if you didn't do anything other than send textual messages that were encrypted between participants based on a decentralized system, that's powerful. But then if you take it a step further and you start thinking about use cases like, say, the gig economy, right? There's one funny thing with ride sharing. The town of or city of Austin, they put a mayor or something came to power, and he hated all the ride sharing stuff. So I think he banned it, or she banned it in the city limits of Austin. And so they tried to set up some crazy half government run GSE type thing that failed, and it was just a debacle. But all the cars would be like right on the city line. And they could do that because they can issue a subpoena to basically two companies, right? They could say, you stop it. What happens when you have peers with personal data stores who can communicate whatever they want? They can form their own market networks basically between themselves. And you could have passengers learn of drivers, people who have this, capacity. And the coordination layer shrinks. It gets much thinner. Right now, the coordination layer is Uber and Lyft, and it's very thick. They do a lot of the matching. They have all the things you call into their endpoint to find things. We can thin that down to the point where there isn't just one or two coordination layers. The coordination layer itself is decentralized. So I can catch a ride, and good luck going and subpoenaing all these people running these personal data stores all across the planet, right? It's gonna be tough sledding. So I hope we get to that point where we can really make the assertion that, you had your run of being able to choke out these easy bottlenecks, but we're going to make systems that make that much more difficult.
Mm-hmm. And it's really funny you say that. I don't know if and also spoiler alert. You might want to skip 30 seconds ahead if you haven't watched the last season of Westworld. But even just mainstream sci-fi shows are looking at things like that existing in just the common media now, even though they're not going into the hows or it's like there's just that acceptance without understanding why in the culture that these types of things are going to happen.
Yeah. I mean, the scary thing is people don't. You saw what the U.S. government has done with tracking metadata from cell phones, and many more things, obviously, than that. And I think the biggest threat we have is that people get comfortable with these centralized systems because you're not affected by it until you are, and then there is no turning back. And we need to put systems in place that protect people, that stand for their digital bill of rights in the 21st century. Like this wasn't, I guess the amendments that were created to enshrine these things were created in a time where people were passing paper, and it was like they had no concept that someone could interdict, like the idea that I could hand you a paper, or I could have my buddy run it over to you on a horse. And now we've built the centralized infrastructure such that you can do all these amazing things, but you're really kind of on puppet strings. And unless we clip those things, and we do it with some urgency, I think we're going to find the world will turn out not so rosy.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just such a powerful framework. You know what I mean? My go-to example and where my head always focuses with this technology is fixing the cloud, like I said earlier. But you literally just explained how you can use this to literally build the decentralized Uber, not just meme about it with a scam coin.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the biggest deal here is that most of the things in the blockchain space, and this is an assertion I've had for quite a while, the vast majority of alt chains and all the things that you would see trying to do these on-chain sort of machinations will probably happen as identity use cases. In fact, they are identity use cases. There is no reason for them to be on the blockchain at some layer one. Layer one. It's more of like exchanges between peers. And I'll give you a really good example. This is one that I've highlighted before on Twitter, which is a lot of people talk about these property transfers. So like tangible property being backed by tokens. I actually think this is a huge mirage. Like there is nothing there for some good reasons. The example I usually throw out there is like, I own 123 Main Street, this house. And I've got this house and I back it with tokens. And ownership is token based, just like my Bitcoin. And someone clubs me and they take this token. And now, do they own my house? Is it a bearer instrument? Can they show up with the cops or whoever? It doesn't need to be centralized cops like that. It could be like some sort of neighborhood watch and say, "Hey man, I got the token. You got to move your shit out." Like obviously not. This is totally laughable. So what really it is there's some sort of authority in an area. It could be it could be a government. It could be a local governance infrastructure that says, we keep some good records, digital records or otherwise, of who people are, like local in our geography, and the fact they have lay claim over certain things like land that they might have purchased and stuff like that. And there has to be someone to co-sign you to say, yeah, no, I believe it's you, right? So essentially, those are identity assertions. Those are credentials that someone says, yeah, the present owner is Dan, and all these people believe it. The bank that Dan banked with believes it. Like all these other people believe it. So you would have to go bonk all those people in the head and take all of their ID keys and then re-sign all of that, versus the token model, which is I take one thing from you and it's all mine. It's irreversible. So you don't really even just want immutability when it comes to some of these like meat space, physical, tangible object transfers. You want some identity proofing in there, and you want some assertions by third parties in there because it's actually a useful thing. And so for those reasons, because you don't actually want immutability and you want it to be not a bearer instrument, I think that a lot of these use cases that people talk about with tangible property are ridiculous. And actually, they should be focusing their effort on creating the apps that use DIDs and onboarding banks and other things to be able to do these things in a digital way through identity.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, like I think not physical things like equities and such make sense to tokenize just purely to make it easier to interoperate with Bitcoin in a market dynamic. But like, yeah, every time I hear people talk about real estate on a blockchain, I just link to Peter Todd talking about standalone one-use seals, and then I mute the thread.
Yeah, man, it's weird when you talk to these people, they want to. I don't know. I think some of their hearts are in the right place. I think some of them are like, infatuated with technology. So they're kind of like, hey, like, there's this hammer. I'm just going to beat everything, even if it's not a nail. And I think that they get too caught up in like using the fanciest, newest on the block stuff when really it's the model they should be thinking about. The model fundamentally doesn't work for layer one bearer token transfers. And I wish the entire space would kind of just step back and think about that a little bit and say like, hey, I have these other tools. Are these other tools maybe better tools? Like, is this even the right way I should approach this before they get down these rabbit holes? And I want to be generous to them. So I want to say that everyone isn't a scammer. I want to believe that there's people out there who are doing things. They might just be doing it in a terrible model.
Yeah, one of my constant sources of facepalm is my personal interest is in using them in a very limited and very specific and understanding way, but using, Bitcoin and timestamping for things like journalism. And I'm constantly having to deal with people and reading things from people talking about how blockchains can revolutionize journalism because they're truth machines, blah blah blah. And it's so annoying because like the first thing they'll say is like, oh well, you can have blockchain oracles, and it's like, okay, can you just stop and think about this for a second? Like, we don't even have a way to measure the temperature. Like, we can't even be certain that if you have an oracle that is supposed to measure the temperature in a given area, that is, provably accurate. That is that already in itself is a hard problem. And you're telling me that there's going to be a blockchain oracle that can tell you, whether some normative judgment or opinion is, true based on it's like, how are you going to do that? It's hard enough to use that kind of thing for quantifiable, stuff. It's going to get even harder when you're talking about did this person do X? Did this person say X? So yeah, I am so annoyed by that kind of thing where it's like, just put a blockchain in everything, put all your journalism articles on the blockchain, and that makes them true, and all this kind of nonsense. It's the same kind of thing.
Yeah, I know you're 100% right, and it's a great example, and it's one that I plan to actually do a POC on myself, just sort of a side project when we have Ion up and running. that actually could help a little bit in this way, but again, through the lens of DIDs and identity. We have a browser, obviously Edge, and I talk to those folks, and we're planning on writing this extension to at least show off this capability of, hey, what if a reporter, say an AP reporter, AP has their own DID, or whatever institution, doesn't have the AP, I'm just using an example. AP has their own DID as an organization. They sign credentials to a photographer, for instance, that they have hired, and says, you're a photographer, at least until we revoke that credential. Maybe they're not in 5 years, but you're a photographer right now for AP, and you can prove this by using your public DID. You'll have private DIDs and public DIDs. You'll use your public DID, and you'll say, yeah, this is me. This is my well-known DID. I'm well known to be a photographer for the AP. And then when they take a picture, they could sign that picture with their keys, their DID keys, and they could offer in a link essentially to the credential in their personal data store or somewhere else. And then when the picture is embedded in browsers, you can have browsers read the picture data, whether it's embedded in EXIF data or HTML attributes, and verify that photo, those exact bits, haven't been tampered with, haven't been changed because it was signed by this DID, and then get the link to the credential that says, yeah, that's an AP reporter, because we know that that's AP's DID. And so without, like you're 100% right, it's not on the blockchain. It's the awareness that this is a reputable identity who is essentially attesting and signing over this bit of data that says, yeah, this hasn't changed. This is the state that I took it in. And having a browser, I mean, how amazing would it be if you had a browser where text snippets and images in the browsing experience, you were able to kind of like right-click or see some sort of UI where it would say, yeah, this checks out, and here's the credentials that back it. Like, this is, it's reputable because of this. Or you might want to look into, who's taking this picture, who's attesting to it. And that is a way I think that we can have potentially a more trusted web.
Yeah, the thing that I've been doing, besides, like, most people, when they're talking about using blockchains with journalism, they at least talk about timestamping and using PKI for, when journalists write stories, they should, sign the story, or even, because the thing that I want to have is something sort of like GitHub, but specifically catering to, journalism, content writing, where what I like the idea of is, that when you read a piece, especially if it's a piece where there's this whole editorial system where, it's not just the journalist or the writer making a piece, it's like multiple people that might be involved. Like bare minimum, I would love to see a system where, you have identities for each of the people that are involved in a piece, and you can go through the piece and say, okay, this person contributed this content, made these changes and things like that, so that you can see, like, who is responsible for which parts of the story, or who contributed parts. And that could then, play into this whole, whatever you want to use for micropayments, about, if you want to divide up, payment in terms of who should get rewarded for doing the work. That's what I would like to see bare minimum, but it is so hard, because it is so hard to even, I think that, that might be relatively easy, but the other thing I would like to see is, because all these people are talking about using, blockchain oracles, it's like, you realize that most journalists don't even link to sources that they quote, or articles that they relate. They don't link to any of their sources. They don't provide any of the data that informs their opinion, and it's so annoying to me. And I try to do the exact opposite. If you go to any of my pieces, you basically see, like, basically any claim that I can make where I have a source for it, I provide it, so that, if anyone wants to question it, if anyone has a problem with how I represented the source or the source itself, they know where I got it from. And so I think that this kind of thing would play well with that, because a lot of journalists, in joining media organizations, they're doing so with, government issued ID and stuff, and public identities. And it would be cool to have the option to do that still, but also have the option to have, less public, maybe more anonymous identities, being able to play into that, but using some of the same mechanisms.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing, you kind of brought up something there on the tail end that I do want to highlight, which is DIDs don't just mean you have one ID. We believe you might have hundreds of IDs, because you might have one or two public persona IDs that you put out there, whether it's pseudonymous or your real name, that you kind of want people to know. It's like common across maybe social media or something like that, where you have this persona, right? I talked to Peter McCormick just the other day, and it's like, he's getting scammed everywhere, or not scammed, but he's getting misrepresented, and imposters are popping up everywhere. It's good to have like one persona that people can actually follow. So that'll make up a couple of IDs, which actually I think will make up the bulk of your transmissions, because most people talk publicly a lot. But then you have all these private DIDs where you could say, you know what, I have this relationship with my, insurance company, and I really don't want to give them my, my public persona ID. I'd rather give them, something else that sections that entire relationship off from everything else. So I can so they don't know, right, the rest of who I am. They just know me by this alternate ID, and I give them a subsection of my life, only what they need to know. Right. So you should think in terms of like you have a bunch of different IDs, which kind of plays in what you talked about. Now, specific to the GitHub stuff, I kind of wanted to bring up a use case that I'm actually going to try and, again, a side project here over the next few months. I don't know if you saw, but we bought NPM. I don't know if you all are coders or, don't know your background exactly. But we bought NPM, and, previously bought GitHub. And NPM is, for anyone listening, is the module repository for code. So if developers want to go write a new piece of code, they go to NPM, they download these packages that help them get started quickly. People have already written a bunch of code and open sourced it, so why not use it? It's a centralized service, right? NPM is a centralized registry, and that's fine. I mean, NPM does a pretty darn good job, but it'd be cool if it was decentralized. So what I want people to think of is these DIDs are not even just for organizations like companies and people. They can also be for intangible things that you control, like a package. So Ion at its core is essentially a large registry. It doesn't tell you identity data, like detailed data about something like personally identifiable, but it does have a list of all the IDs and routing endpoints. So you could just as soon get a DID for your package you're trying to create. You can anchor it in Ion. You can give it this little type flag that says, hey, I'm a package. And then you can scan this essentially flat list of IDs and find all the ones that claim to be packages and follow their links to GitHub, so that anyone running an Ion node that had this like little web app installed that interacted with it could essentially display the same exact view, kind of like we talked about with the ride sharing stuff, the same, and Twitter, the same view that looks like NPM, but it's actually being derived by a global decentralized registry of all these IDs that happen to be packages. And so that's kind of the entrance into that. And then we also could do the same thing with signing code commits to GitHub, like you were talking about. Those are well within the scope of things that I've whiteboarded over these couple of years, that we are eager to get to that point. I don't think we're there yet. We're kind of landing this infrastructure, but I would love to make those things you talked about possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I definitely agree with the importance of allowing multiple IDs, because I think that's not only good from a privacy perspective, being able to, segregate information from people you may not want to give it to, but also because I think that's just how humans handle identity naturally. Like they represent, there's, they have in a way multiple identities sometimes competing, and they present themselves differently to different people, to different companies. So that makes sense, which is like the complete opposite of almost the complete opposite of how a lot of companies and governments try to handle identity, which is to correlate everything together. You only have one, you shouldn't have multiple. And if you do have multiple, that's like a crime or a problem, and they're suspicious of you because of that. And it's like, it's the opposite of how humans actually want to handle their identity.
Yes, exactly. And to that end, there's a couple pieces to this that aren't just the ID layer, right? There's, you all brought it up before, which is how do you secure the keys? Because it's not really, if you don't own your keys, just like you don't own your, don't own your keys, don't own your coins. Same thing with these IDs. You don't own your keys, you don't own your IDs. And then also, how do you keep private disclosures between folks, and credentials and stuff like that aren't tied to an ID? So on one end, we're also going to be publishing this white paper in terms of key security and recoverability. That's basically a new scheme, a new construction of a scheme anyway, called Fuzzy Vault. And this actually could apply just to Bitcoin itself. So this is, kind of crosses the chasm there between money. And fuzzy vault is a scheme that's been in literature for at least, I think, 15 years, around there. And never really had seen super robust implementations in terms of like identity, credentials or anything like that, or keys for IDs. But what the scheme is like right now you have mnemonics, and mnemonics are these like 20 words, right? And you got to get those 20 words in exactly the right order, and you can't spell them wrong, and you have to know all of them. You got to reproduce them, the whole set, and you can't break those up. You can't, like, generally don't give half to someone, half to someone else, because it lessens the security of that seed, because it isn't like Shamir secrets, for instance, an informationally theoretically secure scheme. If you wanted something like what Shamir did, which was the ability to share things, is all this social recovery schemes they talk about are all really based on Shamir. The ability to say, well, I'm going to break up my secret into these 10 shares, and I'm going to make the threshold, so I don't need to get all of them back. The threshold will be 6. I need to, recombine 6 of these shares into, to be able to recover. And the drawback there is those shares are typically not words or memorable or anything. They're these huge, 1 kilobyte of random data. So between the two dominant schemes that are really out there, other than multisig, which is sort of a derivative or different than both of them, they both have drawbacks, kind of almost polar opposites. Like mnemonics today, yeah, they're friendly inputs, but there's a ton of them, and you have to get them exactly, and you have to reproduce all of them. Or you could do Shamir, where you have no prayer of ever remembering one of them. So you basically have to do a QR code for each one, and you can split them up, but it takes all the memorable quality out. So what fuzzy vault is actually a construction that gives you all the features of both of those schemes in one. And it's based on a different kind of math, but essentially what you can do is you can pick any stringifiable input, right? So you can say, I'm going to pick these 20 things, and you have to pick them with enough entropy. So it can't be like mother's maiden name, stuff that's guessable. Obviously, it's not a good deal. But you can pick any inputs. It could be pictures, it could be words, it could be whatever you want. And it has the same properties as Shamir. So it's informationally theoretically secure. So you can shard it. You can say, well, I'm going to give a subset of my inputs away. You can remember them all. It isn't it's order agnostic. So unlike mnemonics, where you have to get them all in the exact order they were generated, it doesn't matter what order you get them in. So I could say generate 16 inputs and encrypt. It's an encryption scheme. I can encrypt my private keys. I can encrypt something. And I can only have to maybe recover 10 or 12, right, of those 16. And then I can also shard them out. So I can give 3U, 3U, 3U. And it doesn't lessen the security of the scheme the same way it would with mnemonics. So this is one way that we had to try and solve for this. And I'm not saying it does solve all the problems there or anything. It's just a white paper at this point that we're implementing. It is a way to try and advance the ability to own your stuff, because the next problem we're going to tackle once we have DIDs down is, this all isn't worth very much if you can't, effectively maintain control. So hopefully that excites people. That's coming out very, very shortly too.
So is it kind of the end user idea there? Like you just break up the shards, and then like to the most extreme user friendly, you could just say shard them around to friends' identity endpoints, and then have them just encrypted there, and then kind of emulate like the type of social recovery schemes where you would have friends like sign off that this key is gone and that this is him now. You would actually just recover the key.
Yeah, so basically what the scheme is Shamir is the one that people use for social recovery today. And Shamir is basically encrypts a secret. You can bundle up a secret and you can split it in shares, these cryptographic shares. And you give people them. And the bigger your secret is, they grow larger, the shares grow larger. So you could have like a kilobyte, for instance, potentially if it's a big thing you're trying to hide. You give people these shares and they're not memorable. So to uncover, the thing that these shares are the composite of, you have to go get a subset of them from your friends. This scheme is different in the sense that you're essentially taking a set of inputs that you have that can be totally friendly inputs. They could be like, maybe I read your Spotify playlist as the app that generates it, and I take like 15 randomly selected songs from the last 300 you played, right? And those are your inputs that you recombine. And you set a threshold of 10, right? So maybe I only need to get like 60% or something of them back. You can take just the inputs, and instead of sending people one giant blobs of stuff they'll never, maybe you tell someone, yeah, you can remember this. You just a small word, kind of like a mnemonic seed word, and it gives the memory component back, right, that you kind of lose with Shamir. And then the difference is obviously with this scheme is it's an encryption scheme. So you have an encrypted file of whatever you're encrypting, and you just have it there. So if you ever want to unlock it, as long as you have the threshold, whatever the threshold you set of your total set of inputs, you can unlock that file just like you would if you had like rudimentary password encryption on like a PDF or something.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just trying to kind of think through like the different potential user flows because like I could probably think of like half a dozen different ones, and obviously you're gonna have a whole different spectrum of like different levels of technical competency that you would have to target that for. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, you're 100% right, and I think the thing I like about this scheme, the potential that it has, we haven't been able to just say, hey, this is the answer or anything yet, but the potential it has is that it gives you actually all the feature optionality of like Shamir and mnemonics kind of in one thing, and there's a lot of optionality in there, so you can kind of set it up such that maybe certain combinations work better for certain types of folks, visual learners or people who can remember a lot or people who have lost their memory or what I mean. And that is the thing that I think can maybe afford us some better UX flows in the future, the opportunity there.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing I was going to note was we're also working on some zero knowledge proof stuff for credentials, mainly for credentials, so that you can prove in zero knowledge things like, for instance, like my driver's license, I shouldn't have to prove my birth date. I should be able to prove that I'm over a certain threshold. And so we've been doing some work in that area. Using not the same ZKP stuff that you see used in cryptocurrency. Like there are people who do use things like bulletproofs for this sort of stuff, but we're using a transparent snark, so it's similar to what you've seen in other areas, to be able to make disclosure like you talked about before, where you should have all your private IDs, where you can sort of keep things private, that shouldn't just be known by everyone. You can actually exchange credentials in ways that the people who are verifying them don't have to know all the data, don't have to be able to track your IDs or any of that stuff. So that's some more work we're doing in this area to kind of backstop, the first initial round of stuff we're releasing with the next stuff that we think we need to bring, to market.
That would be very awesome to finally have that option, because when all of this COVID stuff is done and they start asking me to show ID and uncover my face when I buy beer again, I'm going to start getting really agitated.
Yeah, man. I don't know. You seem like the same sort of person online. I mean, I'm like, again, a libertarian. This whole thing is just has underscored for me really quickly how digital systems are, really core to our lives. Like, how would we fall back, and how different would life look before the internet if we had to do what we're doing today? What certain localities are forcing on folks. Man, I can't even imagine. Like I was born before the internet existed. Like I was born in the early '80s, so I know it. I can imagine it. But can you imagine folks that are a little bit younger who they never knew a world that wasn't connected? So I think they would take it for granted, the digital landscape today, and understand that like, wow, this is, we have to empower digital to be privacy preserving and have these qualities, because it is the true backbone at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's just really, if they can just kick you off or close out your identity in the digital realm, you can make all the semantical arguments about private property, which I make myself all the time, but the end result is still you're effectively depersoning somebody in an increasingly digital world.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, and that's the humanitarian perspective here, is that the reality is, like I said before, governments are going to want, and companies, they're going to want digital forms of proof and all sorts of stuff. And so our choice is either to, and this is why, I started on this at Microsoft, our choice is either to work to instill systems that don't allow for that big red button where they can just literally erase every part of your ID, even parts that don't have to do with maybe your driver's license, right? Or we could have systems that are decentralized, and it's just, we have to win. We just have to win this fight, because if we don't, I think we're going to find ourselves in a real, actual dystopia.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm kind of just plumb out of like directions to take the conversation. Unless you or Janine have anything else.
We covered.
Uh,
I probably rambled a bunch too, so sorry.
Well, yeah, I've mentioned it a few times on the show, so people who are going to listen to this will know this already. But I'm a phone-free person, and I also try to. I basically only have one form of identification, which is a passport, and it is like, and that makes me, having any kind of ID document at all. I mean, that makes me a documented. But it is amazing how many things, how many services are closed to me because I just don't have the right form of ID. It's so weird. Like not using a phone, there are so many services that I can't use because they require a phone, even if they don't need it, like technically as actually using the service, they just require a phone number. There's a lot of things like, for example, Coinbase. Even if I wanted to, which I never ever will, I cannot open a Coinbase account because they take passports as ID. They require driver's licenses, and I don't drive cars, so that's a problem. It's just amazing how many services that there's so much bias about like what forms of identification they will accept, and because so much of the current ID system is basically around like just put everything on the document. It doesn't matter whether it's relevant to whoever's going to ask for it. Just put it all there. And then some, they're inconsistent. Like there's different information on a driver's license than there is on a passport, but still some similar things. And it's so annoying to have to like navigate, who's going to accept this, which service is this acceptable to, or not, and how much of a privacy risk is it for me to be divulging all of this information that I didn't have to divulge. So it's kind of hard to to build something worse than this. I mean, the only worst thing is obviously if they start requiring us to use like Facebook accounts as ID, or well, they're already doing that for Google accounts. I actually had an instance of that very recently where registering a SIM card, or like getting it to work, required downloading an app, which this is not the case for all SIM cards, obviously, but this one in particular required you to download an app. To download the app, you had to have a Google account, and obviously to open a Google account, now you need to have a phone number attached to that. It's like dark pattern, vicious circle.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, and I think that kind of underscores the point that these systems, they're gonna realize themselves as either centralized systems and decentralized, and we'll either kind of lock in the idea that proof and validity of being a person, or really any history that you might be able to offer up to say, hey, I should have access to this. I'm a decent person, comes from a very select set of assertions from authorities, or we create a system that at least gives you the ability, the possibility of creating reputation amongst local communities and making decisions based on some heuristics or things that you believe about the assertion someone presents that could be not from centralized authorities. And we're kind of staying at the precipice, because I think there is going to be a digital transformation in so many areas of these proofs, and we're either going to do it one way or the other. We're not going to do it. There's no third option when we don't do it. And I had this conversation with my buddy a while back. He's an early Bitcoiner. He actually got me into Bitcoin very early, and he was like, "Man, you sure you want to go work and do this?" He's like, we had a really like sobering conversation about what could the next 10 years or 20 years be like, because I've been planning this for almost a decade now, and I said, man, you know what? They are going to do it without us. They're just going to do it in a really shitty way, and it's going to be terrible. So either we jump on the horse and we kind of try and do it as best as we can, and make sure that it has all these properties that could potentially provide freedom for people, or it's some other schmuck who's going to be sitting in that chair and making far worse decisions than you or I. So my choice was like, I'm going to try. I'm going to try as hard as I can, until I either succeed or it can't, or it won't work. And at least I can say at the end of the day that I did something, that I tried. So that's kind of how I feel about all this.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with you 100%, man.
Yeah. Well, hey, thank you so much for the opportunity to address, your audience and stuff. If I would take away anything from this, there's all the technical babble I spewed and stuff that, is all relevant if you want to get into it as like a developer or a technical person. But the biggest thing is be concerned. Be concerned with digital identity, because digital identity, much like that political line of politics is concerned with you, even if you're not concerned with it, digital identity is going to be concerned with you. So, really support people in these areas, people like RWAT, Internet Identity Workshop, all these grassroots places that are trying desperately to deliver you the technology that is freedom preserving in this area, in this sphere, and get involved and advocate. Even if you're not a technical person, advocate for it, because this is your future and your children's future on the line. And it's every bit as important as Bitcoin and the decentralization of money.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, before we put a final bow on it, you want to tell everybody where they can actually download an Ion implementation when this all launches and play around with things?
Yeah, absolutely. So Ion actually isn't just a strictly Microsoft project. So we did the work in DIF, Decentralized Identity Foundation. It's identity.foundation is the URL. It's a 501c6 open membership group. It's a standards-based organization. Ion is a project under Apache 2. It's under the W3C's open patent IPR regime, so it's every bit as open as the standards W3C does. And you can go under there, under the Ion repo, under diffs, in GitHub, and there's a Docker image that you can download and start. The one I think we're putting out runs on mainnet, so it'll fire up. It'll have a Bitcoin node in it. If you have your own Bitcoin node, you can sub out the RPC address, and it'll communicate that way instead. But yeah, that's how I'd get started. Is just run a node. There's some CLIs and some libraries we're putting out for creating IDs. Get used to the system. There's a lot of different things you can do even with IDs at this point, and definitely get us feedback. So like on Illustrator and SideTrees repositories, leave us issues if you run into stuff. Commit PRs if you're technically capable. We need all the help we can get. We won't succeed without it.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I hope everybody enjoyed. We'll catch you later, punks. Adios.
Bye.
Ingen får ett